let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, just want to remind you all that there are 3 Connect assignments that are due by a week from Monday. Okay? So if you haven't gotten started on those, and I know a lot of you haven't, now is the time to get started. Don't put it off, okay? It's not going to help you very much on the first exam if you put it off until a day or 2 right before the exam, because you're not going to be able to absorb that much information all at once, okay? So, you know, if you come to class and listen and take notes, and then do those questions on Connect and even read part of the Smart Book part of it. The reading part is optional, but it never hurts to go over something again, because repetition is how you learn. So the more frequently you study, the better off you'll be. Okay? All right, I know that we went over this second messenger model right at the very end of class on Wednesday. I know some of you, I could hear you rustling, you're putting away your books and stuff and getting ready to go. So I don't know, I don't know how many of you were actually listening to this. So I'd like to go through it again very quickly, okay? Now don't get bogged down in these details down here. This really isn't important, okay? This is just an enzyme cascade where one enzyme activates another enzyme, which activates another enzyme, and that results in a product, or that results in an activated enzyme that could produce some kind of product that changes the metabolism of the cell. Okay. So basically, all of the catecholamines, which are amino acid derivatives, and the peptide hormones or protein hormones, they work by this second messenger mechanism. It's called second messenger because there's 2 messenger molecules. The first one is the hormone, which is right up here. This is represented by this little red triangle. That's carried by the blood from the endocrine gland that produces it. When it gets to its target cell, it binds to a receptor that's embedded in the cell membrane. Now, that receptor, when it binds with the hormone, activates a protein called a G protein. The G protein then activates an enzyme that's embedded in the membrane. Now, there are different kinds of enzymes for different different hormonal systems, okay? One of the first ones that was discovered is called adenylate cyclase. What adenylate cyclase does is it converts ATP to cyclic AMP. So if you cut off 2 phosphates off of an ATP molecule, it kind of causes the rest of the molecule to change its shape, and it becomes cyclic in shape. So it forms cyclic AMP, which stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. You cut 2 phosphates off of the triphosphate compound. The cyclic AMP then activates an enzyme called a kinase. Kinase is an enzyme that adds a phosphate group to another enzyme. So this activated kinase phosphorylates an inactive enzyme, making it an active enzyme, and that changes the metabolic activity of the cell. Okay, so that produces a physiological effect. So there's the first so there's really 3 important parts to this mechanism. There's the hormone, is one. The receptor is the second one. The third one is the enzyme that's in the membrane that produces the second messenger. So I guess there'd be 4. Second messenger is another important part of that. Second messenger then is what causes a physiological change in the cell. Okay, so that in a nutshell is how any of the peptide hormones work. Down here in the left-hand corner of this diagram, it lists some different hormones that work by this second messenger mechanism. Most of these are peptide hormones, and many of them are produced by the hypothalamus. So ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a high hormone that is released by the hypothalamus. It's a releasing hormone that causes the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. FSH and LH, those are both hormones that regulate the reproductive system in both males and females. PTH is parathyroid hormone. That's a peptide hormone that regulates calcium levels. TSH is another peptide hormone produced by the hypothalamus. Stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. That stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroxine. Then glucagon is one of the hormones released by the pancreas that increases blood levels of glucose by causing the breakdown of glycogen. Calcitonin, that regulates calcium levels. And then there are some catecholamines that also work using this second messenger mechanism. Okay. Any questions? Okay, let's go on then to the other major mechanism. There are only really two general mechanisms that are used by hormones. This next one is the mechanism of action of the steroid hormones and also thyroxine. Thyroxine is not a steroid, but surprisingly, it works the same way as steroid hormones. Thyroxine is a derivative of tyrosine, which is an amino acid, and it has 4 iodine atoms attached to it, okay, or iodide ions attached to it. So this diagram right here, really what it's showing is it's showing how thyroxine works. Another name for thyroxine is tetraiodothyronine, and it's often abbreviated as T4. That's mainly what the thyroid gland releases in the bloodstream is T4. However, the active form of thyroid hormone is T3. And T3 is produced when one iodide ion is removed from T4. And that usually occurs inside the target cells. So, T4 is the primary substance that's released by the thyroid. Small amount of T3 is released. T3 is the active form of the hormone. But there's not much T3 that's produced. Most of it's T4. And in order to be transported in the bloodstream, T3 and T4 both have to bind to a transport protein because they're not very soluble in the plasma. So they bind to a transport protein that transports it through the circulatory system. The only form of the hormone, though, that can get into the target cells is the portion that's not bound to the transport protein. So occasionally, the T4 disassociates from the receptor, and it's that small proportion that's disassociated that can diffuse into the target cells for thyroxine. Now, like I said, most of it's released from the thyroid gland as T4. When T4 gets into the target cells, there's an enzyme in the target cells that removes one of the iodide ions, and that forms T3, which stands for triiodothyronine, or T3 for short. T3 is the active form of the hormone. Okay? T4 really doesn't have much activity. So what happens then, once T3 gets into the cell, it diffuses into the nucleus, and it binds to the DNA in the nucleus. In doing so, it acts as a transcription factor. A transcription factor is a protein that stimulates the synthesis of a messenger RNA molecule. Okay? So, once that binds a messenger RNA, which is made up of a single strand of RNA, that single strand of RNA is called a template. It's a template for that's used for the synthesis of a protein. Okay. So once messenger RNA is synthesized inside the nucleus, it then is transported out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it binds with a ribosome. Ribosomes are what synthesize proteins. So ribosome will bind to one end of the messenger RNA. It'll move along the messenger RNA. It'll read that genetic code, and it will put together the protein that's determined by that code, by that sequence of nucleotides. And so the end product. So when the ribosome moves on along the messenger RNA and synthesizes a protein, that's called translation. That's the translation step of gene expression. Production of the messenger RNA, that's called transcription. So first you get transcription of messenger RNA, and then the messenger RNA is translated into protein. That protein then is what causes the metabolic changes inside the cell. Okay. In the case of thyroxine, what it does is it increases the synthesis of the enzymes that are involved in energy production of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and aerobic respiration. So that increases the metabolic activity in the cell. That allows it to produce more energy, and it also produces a certain amount of heat as a byproduct of the use of that energy. So basically, the mechanism of action of thyroxine and steroid hormones is by stimulating gene expression of a gene, which is a sequence of DNA that codes for a messenger RNA, which is then translated into an enzyme. And that enzyme then causes a change in the metabolism of the cell. And in the case of thyroxine, the change is to increase the metabolic rate of the cell. It causes the production of enzymes involved in energy production. So some of the other hormones that use the same mechanism of action include testosterone, which is the male hormone, produces the male secondary sexual characteristics, as well as stimulating sperm cell production, and estrogen. Estrogen is the hormone in women that stimulates, it regulates the menstrual cycle in women. Now, surprisingly though, progesterone, which is the other female hormone that regulates reproduction in the female, progesterone is a steroid, but surprisingly it doesn't work by this mechanism. It works by the second messenger mechanism. So there's always exceptions. There's always exceptions in biology to any general rule. All right. Now, in order for a hormone to carry out its action, it always has to bind to a receptor. So it doesn't do you any good to have real high levels of a hormone if you don't have enough receptors for that hormone. The hormone's not going to be able to produce any effect. Fortunately, however, there are ways for the cells of our body to regulate the number of receptors. There's two different ways that cells can do this. The first way is called upregulation. Upregulation occurs when cells synthesize more receptors that could be inserted in the cell membrane in response to lower than normal levels of hormones. So if you have low levels of hormones, your cells will synthesize more receptors, and they'll insert more receptors into the cell membrane. That will enhance the effect of the hormone. If you have more receptors, it's easier for the hormone to bind the receptor, to find a receptor, and so it'll enhance the effect of that hormone. It's sort of a way of compensating for low levels of hormone. Okay. The opposite of upregulation is downregulation. Downregulation is when the number of receptors in a cell decreases in response to abnormally high levels of hormone. Okay. And one example of this is in some patients that have type 2 diabetes, which what happens in type 2 diabetes is that a person has normal levels of insulin. Insulin just doesn't have an effect on the cells. The cells become insensitive to the insulin. Now, there are probably different mechanisms by which type 2 diabetes happens, but in at least some cases, part of the problem is that the person's pancreas is pumping out too much insulin. If you have chronically high levels of insulin, either because the pancreas is just not working right, or if it's because a person's eating a diet that's high in sugar, because sugar promotes insulin secretion, over a prolonged period of time, those high levels of insulin will cause downregulation of insulin receptors on nearly all the cells of the body. And if that downregulation mechanism gets carried away, there may not be enough receptors for that insulin to even have much of an effect. So now that's not probably the entire mechanism by which type 2 diabetes works, but it may play a role in it. High levels of insulin may also cause downregulation of other enzymes that are involved in glucose metabolism. And so there may be more to it than just downregulation, but downregulation undoubtedly plays a role. Another thing that happens in type 2 diabetes is that, and there's probably different types of type 2 diabetes, because in some forms of it, eventually the pancreas slows down its production of insulin, and the person may not only is the person insensitive to insulin, but insulin levels start to fall over time if a person has unregulated type 2 diabetes over a long period of time. And so that explains why, the usual treatment for type 2 diabetes is exercise and eating a diet that's low in sugar. Okay, those are the two main treatments. There's also medication you can take to help lower blood sugar levels as well. But in some cases, I've seen this happen myself. Some cases, patients with type 2 diabetes are given insulin to inject to raise the insulin levels, because there's, like I said, there's probably different causes of type 2 diabetes. Some of them have normal insulin levels, some of them have higher than normal insulin levels, some of them have lower than normal insulin levels. So sometimes if type 2 diabetes goes on for a long time, they end up giving themselves insulin injections to help regulate their blood sugar. And that's if medication doesn't work, and if it's dieting and exercise doesn't work, or if the person just doesn't follow the advice. So, insulin injections, though, that's the main treatment for type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is when the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin just die. It may be because of an exposure to a virus that leads to an autoimmune disorder that causes destruction of the beta cells in the pancreas. But the usual treatment for that is injection of insulin. All right. Now, some cells have more than one receptor for hormones, And so these hormones can interact. And there's some hormones that require the presence of another hormonal system in order for them to produce their effect. So if a hormone requires the presence of another hormone that binds to its receptor, then that's called a synergistic effect. There's some hormones that cooperate with each other to produce the intended effect. There's other hormones that produce permissive effects. That's one where one hormone enhances the effect of a second hormone that's secreted later. And a permissive effect may occur if the first hormone increases the number of hormone receptors for a second hormone. So there's one hormone causes production of the receptors for another hormone. That allows the other hormone to produce its effect. And then there are some hormones that produce antagonistic effects. That's where the two hormones oppose the action of one another. Two examples are two hormones of the pancreas, insulin and glucagon. Insulin tends to lower blood sugar levels. Glucagon causes them to increase. So those two hormones are going to be antagonistic. They're going to counteract each other's effect. Now, in order to stop a hormone from carrying out its purpose, the hormone has to be eliminated from the bloodstream. And there's several ways that our body can do this. It depends on the exact hormone that we're talking about. Some hormones can be degraded and broken down by their target cells. That would probably be a steroid hormone or something like thyroxine, because they exert their action on the inside of cells. Other hormones are taken up and degraded by the liver and then excreted along with bile. So some of them are broken down by enzymes. Others are filtered out by the kidneys and they're excreted in the urine. So they can be excreted in the urine, or they can be broken down by an enzyme in the liver, or they can be degraded by enzymes in their target cells. In any event, they have to be broken down or excreted in order for them to stop their effects, because some hormones aren't needed all the time. They're only needed at certain times. All right, now this is not the last part of this chapter I want to cover, but I thought I would do this first because it just works out better time-wise. I do want to go over the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland hormones, because those regulate all the other endocrine glands. So we'll probably cover that on Monday. So I want to talk about a few endocrine disorders today. Probably one of the most common endocrine disorders of any is diabetes mellitus. And it's not just one endocrine disorder, it's really a whole family of disorders that are divided up into type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus is a condition which cells cannot take up sufficient glucose from the bloodstream. And that can occur either because of an insufficiency of insulin, or it could be just because of insulin insensitivity. For some reason, the cells don't respond to the insulin. So, as a result, blood glucose levels start to increase because they're not being taken up. Glucose is not being taken up and used by the cells. And actually, glucose is the nutrient that's most easily broken down by cells. So in a way, it's almost a preferred source of energy because it doesn't require any additional processing in order to be broken down. But if cells can't take it up, then glucose is going to start building up in the blood, and elevated levels of glucose in the blood over time can cause all sorts of problems. The main one is that besides the signs of diabetes, what happens is elevated glucose levels, the glucose will react with the lining of blood vessels, and it will, the glucose molecules will actually stick to the lining, and it makes the blood vessels less permeable. And if that happens in the capillaries, then it may make the capillaries less permeable to oxygen and nutrients, and that may result in the death of the tissues that's supplied by those capillaries. So people that have diabetes mellitus, if their blood vessels in their legs become less permeable, they may be more susceptible to infection, because if you get an infection in your foot, your vessels are less permeable, it's harder for cells like neutrophils and macrophages to squeeze through the walls of the blood vessels and fight the infection, like it might be in your foot. And so it's not uncommon for people to get serious infections of their feet or other parts of their body. It usually occurs in the feet, that can lead to gangrene. Gangrene is an infection that causes gas bubbles to form in your blood vessels, and it causes rapid death of tissue, and it tends to spread, and it can result in patients that have to have part of their feet or their whole leg amputated. Same thing can happen in the eyes. If you have elevated blood glucose levels, the high levels of glucose can coat the inside of the blood vessels in your eyes, and it can lead to blindness. So blindness is a side effect of diabetes. Same thing can happen in the brain or the heart, and that could lead to heart attacks or strokes. So people that have diabetes, if it's not controlled, there are ways of treating it, but if it's not controlled, it can lead to an early death. Now, one of the signs of diabetes mellitus is the presence of high levels of glucose in the urine. Now, in a healthy person that does not have type 2 or does not have diabetes mellitus, normally blood glucose levels are relatively low. And the blood glucose is low enough that when the kidneys filter the blood, nearly all of the glucose can be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream by the kidneys. But the transport mechanism that reabsorbs glucose requires a transport protein in the tubules of the kidney. And there's a limited number of those transport proteins that can reabsorb glucose. So if you have real high levels of glucose, there's not enough transport proteins to reabsorb all the glucose from the blood. If that happens, then that person will excrete the remaining glucose that doesn't get reabsorbed. So presence of glucose in the urine is a sign of diabetes mellitus, and the technical term for that is glucosuria. Okay, glucosuria means there's glucose in the urine. That was first discovered because in people that had diabetes mellitus, before they knew what it was, the urine of those patients that had diabetes tended to attract flies. Flies attracted to the urine because it had a lot of sugar in it. It was sweet. Now, another effect is when you increase the levels of glucose in your urine, that increases the osmolarity of the urine. And so that will actually draw water out of the body. And so that will lead to excessive urination, which is called polyuria. So if you have to urinate all the time, like if you have to get up 3 or 4 times in a night, that could be a sign of diabetes. Not necessarily, but it might be. The other problem it has, if you lose a lot of water in your urine, because you have a lot of glucose there, and it draws a lot of water out of your body, you're gonna start to get dehydrated. And so that causes polydipsia, which is excessive thirst. So you'll be thirsty a lot of the time. And then another sign of uncontrolled diabetes mellitus is that if your cells cannot absorb glucose, either because there's not enough insulin or because those cells are insensitive to insulin, maybe because they don't have enough receptors, then your cells really are starving for nutrients because glucose is a preferred nutrient. So what our cells have to do then is they have to use other macronutrients as a source of energy for the synthesis of ATP. So they have to start using things like either protein or lipids. Okay? If they start using lipids, lipids are broken down into 2 carbon units called acetyl coenzyme A. And so in people that are diabetic, since their cells can't use glucose, they'll start breaking down lipids like triglycerols that have fatty acids. Fatty acids are broken down to acetyl coenzyme A. So acetyl coenzyme A levels in the blood start building up because the cells of their body is producing a lot of acetyl coenzyme A. If you have elevated levels of acetyl coenzyme A in your blood, those molecules will start reacting together to form ketone bodies. And that can result in a condition called ketoacidosis. Okay? Now, ketone bodies are not necessarily a bad thing because some tissues in our body can use ketone bodies as a fuel. But if they build up too high, it can cause acidosis and can throw off the pH balance of your body. That in turn can affect some of your electrolyte levels, and it can cause problems. All right. So type 1 diabetes mellitus is thought to be possibly an autoimmune disorder that results in destruction of the beta cells in the islets of the pancreas. Exact cause of that is not known, although there may be a hereditary component. A lot of times it will occur fairly early on in life after a person is infected with a virus. But it doesn't always occur. It just occurs in some people. And so the treatment for type 1 diabetes is just either injections of insulin, or they can wear an insulin pump that meters out the insulin continually during the day. Insulin pump is a little bit better because it keeps your glucose levels a lot more even. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is sometimes called insulin resistance or insulin insensitivity. That probably has a genetic component to it because it tends to run in families. But the incidence of type 2 diabetes is more prevalent in people that are obese and sedentary, that don't do much physical activity. So the treatment for type 2 diabetes, the first treatment is usually go on a diet that's low in carbohydrates, so you don't have too high of levels of glucose in your blood, and exercise. The reason exercise helps lower blood sugar levels is that exercise requires muscle contraction. Muscle contraction uses up ATP, and ATP can be produced from glucose. And so if you undergo a lot of exercise, your muscles are going to be using a lot of that glucose to synthesize ATP that's needed for the contractions. So that'll help lower blood glucose levels. Adipose tissue, on the other hand, adipose tissue doesn't use up much glucose. Once it's formed, it just sits there. It doesn't do anything. And so if you have a high percentage of your body weight in the form of adipose tissue, your body's not going to be using up much of that glucose, and the glucose levels in your blood will be higher. Sometimes, however, and my dad had type 2 diabetes, and I couldn't understand it because I was always taught that the treatment for type 2 diabetes was diet and exercise, but his doctor had him take insulin injections. So it's probably because he had a different form that, in which his pancreas weren't producing as much insulin anymore because of downregulation from the high levels of glucose, and so the insulin injections helped. All right, any questions? All right, so I just went through and explained, so I already talked about this. I got ahead of myself, I guess. So it talks about the microvascular disease. That's when the sugar coats the inside of the blood vessels, making them less permeable. So that can result in, like I said, heart disease, kidney failure, blindness, and infections of the feet. All right, now, there's another endocrine disorder that sounds similar to diabetes mellitus, but it's a completely different disorder. And that's diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus doesn't have anything to do with insulin whatsoever. It's a deficiency of a different hormone entirely. Diabetes insipidus is caused by a deficiency of antidiuretic hormone, which is abbreviated ADH for short. Another name for ADH is vasopressin. That's another name for antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. ADH is secreted by the posterior pituitary in response to dehydration or high osmolarity levels. That's what happens if your body loses too much water. And antidiuretic hormone stimulates the production of transport proteins in the kidneys called aquaporins. It actually increases the number of aquaporins in the collecting ducts. That allows the kidneys to reabsorb more water, which is going to make your urine a lot more concentrated, so that causes your body to conserve water. Now, if your body doesn't produce enough ADH, your tubules of your kidneys, collecting ducts of your kidneys, aren't going to have as many aquaporins, and so your kidneys are not going to be able to absorb as much water. So instead, you'll lose that water in your urine. If you have really low levels of ADH, your kidneys aren't going to be able to reabsorb hardly any water, and you'll produce very copious volumes of urine. Some patients with diabetes mellitus can produce up to 15 liters of urine a day in some extreme cases. So that produces excessive polyuria without glucose in the urine. So the only way to treat that would be to administer pharmacological amounts of ADH to the person. Diabetes insipidus is a lot rarer than diabetes mellitus, though, so it's not very common. All right, let's do a couple of review questions here. This first one has to do with classification of hormones. So progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone are all classified as what kind of hormones? Now we'll be talking about what exactly these hormones do towards the end of the semester when we get into the reproductive systems. that's it then. Let's take a look at the results. Most of you said steroid hormones, and that's correct. Okay. By the way, I wanna mention something related to this. This just reminded me of it. In chapter 2 of your textbook, which we skipped most of it, there's a boxed kind of a clinical case study in there. Talks about anabolic steroid use. Most anabolic steroids are androgenic. They're similar in structure to testosterone, and they can have masculinizing effects on the body. Okay? And in the in the 1950s, it was discovered that some of the weightlifters from, I don't remember if it was from Russia, at that time it was probably from the Soviet Union. They discovered the reason they were beating the Americans so badly in weightlifting is because they were taking anabolic steroids, which increases muscle mass and increases strength. So sometimes they would take anywhere from 10 to 100 times larger of a dose than what their body normally produces in the form of testosterone. And the problem with that is that can result in downregulation. And I don't quite understand how this works, but apparently, if you get too much of a hormone, if you get really super high levels of a hormone, sometimes our body converts it into a different form of hormone. So apparently, these weightlifters were given injections of testosterone to increase their muscle mass. They were given such high levels that their bodies were converting testosterone into estrogen, and the estrogen was causing feminization of their body. So they would have gynecomastia, which is enlarged breasts. These men that were taking high levels. So when the United States found out about this, there was one sports medicine doctor in the United States that thought, well, I wonder if we can synthesize, if we can modify the testosterone molecule, make it a little bit different, maybe it wouldn't have as many side effects, yet it would still stimulate muscle growth. And so he worked with some pharmaceutical companies to come up with some analogs of testosterone that were slightly different, in the hope that it wouldn't produce the negative side effects, but yet it was still building muscle mass. The problem is that real high levels of anabolic steroids can elevate, it can cause an increase in blood cholesterol for some reason. That cholesterol can clog up the arteries, and it can make a person more susceptible to a heart attack and other problems. So it was discovered there were a lot of negative side effects of the use of anabolic steroids, so most of the organizations that regulate sports eventually banned that, probably around 1960. The Olympic organization that regulates the use of drugs in the Olympics, they banned it. Most sports ban the use of anabolic steroids. The other thing would high levels of that would cause downregulation of some of the receptors in the testes. It would cause the testes to shrink. Sometimes that would cause the men to become infertile. So there are some negative side effects. Okay, let's do one or two more questions. Okay. It says peptide hormones bind to what kind of receptors? Do they bind to intracellular or membrane-bound receptors or extracellular receptors? You actually should be able to answer this question just based on the structure of peptide hormones. knowing something about the chemistry of peptide hormones, which are small proteins. Because proteins are big polar compounds. Large polar molecules have a hard time going through the membrane, the cell membrane. In fact, they can't go through the cell membrane unless there's a specific transport mechanism. So instead, they have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the membrane. So membrane bound is correct. Okay, let's do one more. According to the steroid hormone mechanism of action, do second messengers activate enzymes, or are new proteins synthesized via gene expression? Let's take a look at the result. Okay, actually, according to steroid hormone action, that stimulates new protein synthesis by way of gene expression through transcription and translation. Okay, now, got one more rhetorical question to ask you. Okay. Thinking about the mechanism of action of peptide hormones and steroid hormones, which one do you think would be able to act faster? Would the second messenger mechanism be faster, or would the steroid mechanism of action be faster? Peptide? Why is that? What?
50-50, yes.
Okay, fair enough. So why would that second messenger mechanism be faster than the steroid mechanism? So remember, everything's controlled by enzymes in the cell, right? And with the second messenger mechanism, the enzymes that need to be activated, they're already in the cell. They're already sitting there ready to be activated. So they don't have to be synthesized. But with the steroid mechanism, those proenzymes have to be synthesized from scratch. So, you know, the hormone receptor complex has to bind to the DNA. That stimulates transcription, so you have to have transcription. Then the messenger RNA has to move out of the cytoplasm. It has to be translated by a ribosome. That all takes time. And then once the protein is synthesized, it probably has to be activated as well. So there's a lot more steps involved in the steroid mechanism of action, and you have to synthesize all of the proteins that you need from scratch. Whereas in the second messenger mechanism, the proteins are already there in the cytoplasm. They just have to be activated. And that just takes an enzyme to activate them, and that can happen very quickly. So yeah, second messenger mechanism is going to be a lot faster than the steroid mechanism. So, all right, we're out of time, so stop here.